Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those who are joining us again. This is week 3 of the Embracing Change webinar series. Welcome to those who are just joined us for the first time. I want to first begin by thanking you for the generosity of your time. Truly appreciate it. We've been speaking about improving communication, relationships as they are being challenged during this time of cocooning. We're talking about preservation of wealth, preservation of harmony and unity, legacy, value systems, and looking at how our state of being is impacting us as we experience all of these things. Today, we have what I consider a legend in the space of family advisory, a straight shooter, no nonsense person who I truly admire and respect, along with many of the families that he serves, who's going to take us through what I consider a bit of a joyride, because I love when he shares with the energy of how to use your time that we have now in this cocooning to share about wealth, and what are the do's and don'ts, and we have a treat because we have his son Luca, who's going to join us as well, and he's going to share from his perspective how that communication landed or didn't land, and see how he sees it from a different perspective. So please, let's welcome Philip. Thank you very much, Philip, for joining us today and making this an incredible experience. And Luca, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Faisal. What we're going to do, Luca and I, is to spend the next 50 minutes or so going through just some various ideas about communication about family wealth. I'm going to do a lot of the talking, but Luca is going to give some of his perspectives, as Faisal has said. There are lots and lots of slides which everyone can get a set of if they like. We're not going to go through every single slide because I mentioned to Faisal a little bit earlier this morning, our time, that we thought we had about 5 hours to do this webinar, but he told us 50 minutes. So we're going to stick to some high points. We hope we're going to make it interesting, fun, meaningful, and useful. Feel free to post any questions or comments, and feel free to disagree with anything that I say or Luca says. And that'll also make it more interesting. And Faisal is going to raise those questions either while we're going or at the end of the session. So just a little bit about what it is that we're trying to achieve in the discussion we're going to have today. It's really about trying to get across that communication within families is one of the most important things, in my view, about wealth. I'm going to be saying a little bit more later on about my own background. I'm a tax lawyer, but I work with families around the world. And one of the things that I've learned, and I've written a book about this subject, which I'll also mention a little bit later on, is that wealth all too often is destructive of families, family relationships, and family businesses. And if there's one thing that I've learned is that it is absolutely the surprises that come up in families that create all of the problems. And the more the younger generation in particular is aware about what's going on, the more there's communication, you can really avoid many of the problems that families have. But all too often, people leave it way too late, if ever, to have these conversations within families. And that's really what we want to talk about. And we're also going to touch on the importance of families really understanding their own succession plans, because if you don't understand your own succession plan, you're getting kidnapped by advisors, which is something that I'm very much against. As much as I've made my living advising families, I also have seen all too often advisors who have taken advantage of their positions. And it's absolutely critical for the younger generation in particular to know the right questions to ask of advisors. So we're going to talk about a number of these issues as we go through, which I believe are really vital. So a little bit about us, about Luca and I. I myself, first of all, and most importantly, am not American. I'm a Canadian. I also have some other nationalities, including UK and Romania and other things on the go, which we'll talk about nationalities a little bit later on. I started out as a corporate tax lawyer. That's what I really studied. and went to law school in both Canada and the US. I started my career in New York as a corporate tax lawyer. I moved to Hong Kong in 1982, joining Baker McKenzie, where I spent close to 30 years, both in Hong Kong and in Switzerland. And what happened in my career is that I moved from being a corporate tax lawyer to being more of what I would call a wealth management lawyer, working for the owners of businesses and looking not only at issues in and around tax of companies, but also tax in and around the issues affecting families. I retired from Baker McKenzie about 10 years ago, not to do nothing, but what I do now is a lot of teaching around the world, both in Asia and in Europe. I do a lot of writing, a lot of thinking, trying to cause trouble wherever I go. And what I really have been focusing on more and more are the holistic issues affecting families, not just the issues of taxation, but looking globally at communication within families, succession, and political risk planning, and many, many other issues that, again, I hope we're going to have a chance to touch on. But maybe, Luca, you can say a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to everyone on this call.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Luca. I also come from somewhat a legal background. I completed a law degree at Durham University before going on to complete a master's at Columbia University. Since then, I've worked for a medical company and a medical technology company in New York for a few years. And for the current lockdown, find myself residing in London.
Okay, so let's then move on. And I'd like to start off by saying that, you know, when we talk about wealth owning families and we talk about the need for communication, something that I believe very strongly is any amount of wealth is enough wealth to destroy a family. We don't have to be talking about these issues only among billionaires or millionaires or whatever you want to call them. Really, any amount of money is enough money to really create problems. And it's really interesting, when I moved to Hong Kong as an innocent Canadian in 1982, many families in Hong Kong, when I was talking to Chinese families and I would talk about the things they need to think about, they would say, Philip, you don't understand Chinese families. We're different from you Westerners. We never fight. We don't need lawyers. We don't need to plan all these things. I would talk to Indian families. They would say to me, you don't understand Indian families. You know, we all live together in one compound. We all love each other. We never fight. Well, the reality, as we see today, is that virtually every well-known family in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in India, has been getting into massive, massive litigation and fights that have been destructive of their families and of family wealth. And really, I am a believer that while culture is important, and sure, there are differences in culture when you talk about Chinese families or Middle Eastern families and Sharia law and all these things. The reality is families are more similar than they are different, and the kind of issues you face are around the world. You know, I like to sometimes give some examples, and I'll only give one right now. You know, some of you may have heard of the Chadha family in India. The Chadha family, billionaire family in US dollars, and a family where when dad died, he didn't really leave things very clear. Two of the Chadha brothers were arguing over a small family farmhouse about who would be the owner of that family farmhouse. And they showed up at the farmhouse with their bodyguards and ended up in an argument about who would own the farmhouse. And they shot each other to death. So that's Indian families getting along. And there are lots of families and examples where this kind of thing can happen. So I feel that there's a real responsibility in the older generation to plan for the future. And there are lots and lots of things which are cultural differences, like in Asia, where you have, you know, many Chinese families, and also in other cultures, where they say, well, you know, we leave everything to the older son. Well, the problem that I have with that in many families is not that it's right or wrong, but what I want to question is, are the parents using the culture of their parents to impose an approach that then affects the younger generation? In other words, if the younger generation were raised in the West and have become very Westernized, that older son may not appreciate the notion that the responsibility of the older son in Chinese tradition was to take care of the whole family. I've run across many families where the older son is perfectly happy to say, oh, great, I got all the money, and runs off into the sunset. And meanwhile, the other siblings are pretty unhappy about the way they've been treated. So I am one of those advisors who doesn't just write down what clients tell me they want to do. I like to question the issue, their thinking, and make sure that it really fits, not to impose my own values, but to really hold up a mirror and ask, is it really going to work? Now, something that also is very important about this issue about wealth destroying families is that it's inevitable in many, many families, and it's almost every family, where there are issues, there are tensions between siblings, there are tensions between different family members. And what can be very important is to try to avoid those tensions flowing down to the younger generation and find ways to let the younger generation develop their own relationships within families. And this from both a personal perspective, but also in terms of family wealth, because the more you have harmony among the younger generations, the less you're going to have litigation and fighting and destructive activity. But maybe, Luca, you have some comments about that and from your own experience.
Sure. Just to give an example of how you can sort of structure things to get over this tension within families. Something that happened with our family. My mother and her sisters don't always have the best of relationships. There's definitely some tension between them. And for about a decade of my life, I never met the cousins of my family, my aunts and uncles, my aunt's children. And so what my grandfather did, in a way to get my generation to get along with each other despite the tensions of our parents, was to organize a trip to China, a holiday just with me and my cousins without any of our parents. And all of us, we hadn't seen each other in about 10 years, and we ended up going on this trip together, and we didn't talk about anything to do with our parents, why they might have strife with each other, and we ended up forming relationships with each other irrespective of our parents. The result of this trip is that anytime I would be in Australia, I'd be in London, I would be in the same place as one of my cousins, we can now create this kind of relationship without having the tension of the rest of our family being imposed on us. We can create these relationships irrespective of that history that was already in the family. This is just one example, but it's a way you can try to forego those tensions that might already be in place.
So let's move on and talk a little bit about the psychology of wealth, which is really fun. One of the things that in my retirement I'm doing more and more is dealing with the reality that money makes people crazy. And wealth all too often creates psychological problems. I was sitting at a dinner in London and the woman sitting next to me, we started to chat and I asked her, what do you do? And she said, I'm a therapist. And I said, oh, really? What do you do? What do you specialize in? And she says, I work with addiction. I work with people who have drug addictions and food addictions. I work with addicts. And I said, do you work with people who are addicted to money? And she said, what do you mean by that? What is an addiction to money? And I explained to her, many of the families that I work with, what I see are people who are addicted to money. They never know how much is enough. They measure the success of their children by how much money their children make. They use their money to try to control family members. And as we discussed this, she said, well, yeah, most of the families I work with, exactly, they have this money addiction. And she and I are now collaborating and we send clients to each other. It's just so interesting when you look at this issue about the psychology of wealth. There are lots and lots of fun things that I can talk about here. You know, something that a lot of people ask me sometimes, they say, Philip, you know, how do I know if my son is about to marry a gold digger? How do I know if that girl that he's brought home, or that guy that my daughter has brought home, how do I know if they're a gold digger? How do I know, how do I identify whether they're gold diggers? Well, good news, it's very easy to answer that question. The reality is they're all gold diggers. Everyone is a gold digger. You know, you look at Faisal and you say, wow, good looking guy. He's got a beard, you know, he's kind of cool looking. He's written a book. He's got a bit of dough. Money comes into the picture. If it doesn't come into the picture at the beginning of the relationship, it's going to come into the picture at the end of the relationship. And I may be very unromantic about these things, but my philosophy is basically hope for the best, but plan for the worst. The bottom line is they're all gold diggers. And when it comes to mistresses and toy boys, and it's mostly mistresses, you know, I used to think that mistresses were an Asian concept. When my first son was born, my older son, Joshua, who I think is also listening to this webinar, I went to the hospital to look at all the babies. By the way, they all look all the same. And, you know, next to me was one of my clients, and we shook hands, and he also just had a baby. He introduced me to the mother of his baby. It wasn't his wife. I was this innocent Canadian in Hong Kong when I first arrived there in the 1980s, and I thought that mistresses were a Chinese concept because all of my Chinese friends and clients had mistresses. In those days, they were all in Taiwan. Nowadays, they're in mainland China or elsewhere. And, you know, I had this impression. I then moved to Switzerland in 1995, began working more with families from around the world. And that's where I learned that mistresses are not an Asian concept, they're a global concept. And I have lots of things to discuss in relation to mistresses, but the reality is that relationships move into economic relationships and all too often into blackmail. And there are ways of planning when you're dealing with both mistresses, toy boys, and all of these kind of situations, including using trusts, using foundations, using insurance strategies. I'm a great believer, never give a lump sum of money to a mistress. A year later, she'll be back saying, I lost all the money in Macau, and if you don't give me more money, I'm going to tell your family all about my existence. Much better is to create financial structures such as an insurance annuity that basically says, my mistress is going to get 100,000 US dollars a year for the rest of her life, inflation adjusted. But if my family ever finds out about her, the money stops. You can use this kind of planning to, in a way, deal with how families work or how relationships work. What about second families? All too often, I'm being asked by 60-year-old, 70-year-old men to you know, discuss the fact that they're about to get married to a young 20-year-old that they think is marrying them for love. And I'm the one who has to explain money may be coming into this picture. And what's very important is to discuss all kinds of things in and around this issue and how to plan, how to protect against the kind of issues that arise when people are getting into second marriages and third marriages and fourth marriages. And the children are very, very important, because one of the ways to deal with somebody who may be marrying for the second or third time, where obviously the children of the first marriage are going to be very concerned, is to actually make arrangements to preserve what those children are going to get and to make sure those children understand that. And if you're able to do that, that may actually change relationships within the family and make the whole process a much smoother one to deal with. Lots and lots of issues that come up in this area. But one of the issues in the psychology of wealth that's kind of an amusing one is I get a lot of clients who say to me, Philip, you know, my kids don't know we have any money. My kids don't know that we're wealthy. And I always laugh and I say, yeah, you think your kids don't know you're wealthy. The reality is, you know, you've got a car taking them to a private school. You're staying in five-star hotels around the world. You've got a house with a swimming pool and servants. Your kid looks on the internet. They know immediately that you're one of the wealthiest people in your country or what it is you have. Very often, the children may actually think you have more money than you actually have, and that may have an impact on how those children act. And I'm a great believer that in the communication within families, kids should know where they stand on the financial side of things. And one of the things my wife and I did very early on with our kids was to actually tell them, not by talking about amounts of money, but what we basically said to them is, look, if we're not around, here are the people that you need to contact if something goes wrong, if we're not around. But we've arranged things in such a way that you're not going to come into any serious money apart from help with education and health until you're 50 years old. And Luca, at the time, I think he was 12 or 13, he said, are you guys crazy? You might as well just give it to charity if that's going to be the case. And my wife immediately said, fine, we're going to give it to charity. And Luca said, no, wait, not so fast. But I do feel that it was important that we made this kind of communication. Maybe Luca, you can make some comments about this and whether what I'm saying is true or not.
Sure, it's true. I did say that. But I think this, being able to talk to your children about this has two real big impacts here. One of them mainly is so your kids can really understand their own trajectory. In many cases, they might think the moment I turn this age or that age, I'm going to inherit this money. I have no need to try so hard in school. I don't need to try so much in university because I'll earn this money anyways. And what happens is that the kids, in a sense, will end up waiting for their parents to die. They might not have that full-time job that they would have otherwise strived for, and they'll be essentially waiting for their inheritance to come in because they haven't done other actions because they thought this is what they would be coming into. On the other side of things, if you were to tell your children with many different signposts, without necessarily going to many details, saying you'll inherit this amount of money here, this is what would happen here and there, it allows your children from a young age to plan out their own trajectories, understand where they need to focus more, if they need to push for a job or in this direction or that direction. And just being able to be honest about it, it's more of an insurance to make sure your children don't go in a fully wrong direction in a sense, and it helps them plan for themselves. You can be in as much, you can explain this in as much detail or in as little detail as you want, but being able to signpost things, I think, is an advantage for sure.
And this, this all has to be very age appropriate, but if you wait until your kid is 25 or 30 to have this kind of conversation with them, it's a little bit late because they've already made choices regarding their education and otherwise. The earlier you have this kind of conversation, the better it is. Something I don't want to spend too much time on, but it is important for families, we have limited time today, is how the world has hugely changed in the area of taxation. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a tax lawyer. I spent 15 years working in Switzerland. I know what's gone on in the world. I've been very much involved also in advising governments when it comes to information exchange and other things. We are now in a very, very different world than we were just 4 or 5 years ago. One of the biggest developments that has taken place is the move to automatic information exchange, where information about what people have in one country gets automatically exchanged with other countries. We have families who live in Hong Kong and Singapore where we have a territorial tax system. There's no need for governments to actually know what you have in Switzerland or wherever you may have that other money, but now that information goes to that country. And this raises many, many issues, including political risk issues, because there are many countries around the world that cannot be trusted with this kind of information. And for families, what becomes very important is to understand how transparency in the tax world affects them, affects their wealth, affects the younger generation. Lots and lots of issues about this. But we also have at the same time, and in the current situation with governments spending massive amounts of money in relation to the coronavirus crisis, they're going to have to pay for all of the spending that they're doing. And that's going to impact dramatically how tax rules change and other things develop that affect families. We also have the reality of wealth and income inequality that's in this picture, and many, many different views that are being expressed. Some of you may have heard of an economist in France named Thomas Piketty. Thomas Piketty has written several books about wealth and income inequality. I mention him because he is very much respected around the world. He's been invited to speak at the US Congress. He's listened to by many people around the world. He has a student of his, Gabriel Zuckman, who's a professor in the US, who actually advised the Warren campaign in relation to many of her proposals on wealth taxation and otherwise. Among other things, what Thomas Piketty advocates is that to deal with wealth and income inequality, when people die, all their assets pretty much should go to the government. And the younger generation should simply start fresh with zero. How would you feel about that, Luca?
In theory, there's some benefits from it. In a sense, it also moves a little bit towards theory communism, where you're sort of setting things up so anyone can have any job they want. You serve the greater society rather than your families. But just an immediate problem in practice, for example, is if a family knows that the money won't pass through inheritance, they'll try their best to spend as much as they can immediately to take advantage of the money the family has. So while in theory some of these might make sense, in practice, people find ways to get around these rules or play by their own rules to act more selfish.
So lots and lots on the tax side. I'm going to skip over some slides that talk about how information is flowing around, but something that is very important for families to understand is how information moves around. And it's part of family communication, because the more the younger generation understands how all this works, they understand the importance in some cases of having flexibility about where they may choose to live in the future, and how this will impact governments getting information, how this will impact tax exposures, how this will impact family business, how this will impact family wealth. In too many families, the children are very innocent of all of these issues, and the more innocent they are, the more unable they are to make decisions that will actually be in their own interests. I'm not a believer that people should drive their lives on the basis of taxation, but they do need to be aware of the consequences of decisions they make on where they live and the choices that they make. There are a lot of issues in and around choosing where to live. There are a lot of issues in and around choosing citizenships. At the moment, there are lots of possibilities of holding multiple citizenships. I'm actually somebody who believes quite strongly that in the years to come, we will see this being very much restricted. I believe governments are going to stop the ability of people to have multiple citizenships. And as a result, I'm a believer in getting as many citizenships as you can while you can get them. And I'm also a believer in something that I call family diversification, where you have somebody who's making investments. An investment advisor will always say, the safest thing is to diversify your investments. I actually believe that in addition to diversifying your investments, if you really want to look to preserving family wealth and family businesses for the future, you need to diversify how assets are owned, diversify the ownership structures, but also consider diversifying where family members live. Because if you have a family that really looks after each other and people take care of each other, having family members in different places is a very useful thing. But I wonder, Luca, if you want to make some comments about international families and living in different places and different citizenships.
Sure. Well, being the son of my father, I have 4 passports, for example. So it's definitely something that he prescribes to. Just to give an example of where this is important is not only in terms of income tax, where you're living and where you're earning money can vastly affect the amount you earn, but also in terms of things like inheritance tax, how much money gets passed down depending where your assets are held, where your estate is. All these things can change your gross income by huge amounts that people might underestimate. One country might have an income tax rate of 50%, where another one might have it at 3%. So living one place compared to another can really change the scope of your entire career. And understanding the world of taxations and how you can take advantage of it is really something that is often underestimated.
What about citizenships? Is it useful to have multiple citizenships?
At least for myself, it helps going through the quicker lines in the airports. And maybe in terms of, also a big one is really in terms of career. For me, for example, I lived in New York for a while, and one of the main reasons I moved away was because of the US visa. I'm not an American citizen, and as a result, getting jobs in the US compared to people who do have an American passport, there's definitely a huge competitive advantage in having the citizenship. And this is the same as in any country. Right now, I'm living in London, and I'm residing here during the lockdown. An international person without the British passport might not have been able to do that. So having more passports than not, at least in my life, has definitely been advantageous in the long run.
Great. Now, what are the needs of wealth-owning families? And again, this is part of communication within families. And one of the things that I like to observe is that families very often don't know what it is that they need. They don't know what it is they need to discuss. And what is very dangerous are advisors who sometimes say to families, "What can I do for you today?" The problem is the family doesn't actually know what it is that can be done. And as a result, it's very important that awareness is raised within families about what those needs are. Now, there are some needs that affect all families. Everyone, sad to say, is going to die one day. And as a result, we all need to think about succession. We all need to think about how assets are going to pass. But there are also needs that may be specific to a particular family because there's a particular issue in that family. There's a disabled child, or there's an issue that needs to be addressed. That's a need specific to that family. And then there are needs that are driven by tax and other issues relevant to where the family may be living, or where the family may be investing, or where they may have citizenship. So there are lots and lots of needs that families have, and needs are very holistic. There's not just the need to minimize tax or the need to address issue A or issue B. You need to really be looking at all of these issues on a very holistic way. One of the needs is the need for privacy. In a world where information about your assets are being passed all over the world, one of the needs is just to simply understand what countries have what information on my family, and am I comfortable with that? And I have a lot of families that I work with in places like Nigeria and elsewhere who have chosen, sadly, to leave their country, live in another place, because of the fear that if the country is aware of all the assets they have around the world, that may be a form of political risk that they are facing. So understanding what countries have what information on your family is a very, very important thing. And also it's important to note that banks sometimes makes, or very often make, lots of mistakes. And you better make sure that your banks are providing the right information to the right countries, or there may be lots of issues that arise. But there are lots of needs that families have that have nothing to do with taxation. And we're not going to be able to go through this entire list, but 2 points that I'm going to pick out of this list are relating to divorce, and another one is asset gathering and identification. What do I mean by that? Well, asset gathering and identification, very simply, are you sure that you know what assets you actually have? And do your children have an awareness of the questions that they should be asking if you're not around? You may have art collections, jewelry collections, you may have safe deposit boxes in different places, businesses, shares. Who's actually going to track all those things down? And what I've seen all too often when people pass away, that's when servants, advisors, and others help themselves steal assets. That's also when the younger generation runs into lots of issues and difficulties on that front. So one of the things we've done with our kids is to make sure at least that they know who to contact if something happens to the both of us. But Luca, any comments on that? Whether you know enough? Do you know enough?
I think similar to when we discussed wealth psychology, with everything in this area, talking about it and knowing more, being more informed is always an advantage. And at least in our family, we have an idea of where to go, who to go to ask questions with. A plus and minus of this is many of these individuals are also family friends. And it comes down to the degree of how much can you trust these individuals. A lot of the time you're laying this trust in other people's hands. And there's definitely that advantage of having things out in the open. But you also have to have this trust in place. And even if it's a financial advisor, that does not necessarily mean it's someone you can trust 100%.
So something I would advocate, and we haven't done this with our kids yet, and we need to do more of this, is every year maybe have a little bit of a family retreat, actually go through the assets, go through where things are, make sure that you're asking the what ifs, and understand that no succession plan is a succession plan. In other words, if you haven't done your planning and something happens to you, there are rules, laws that are going to say who gets what. And it's good to ask the what ifs and see what happens. Another topic that I want to mention here is divorce. I was at a conference giving a talk to a number of families with a friend of mine in Hong Kong who's one of the top divorce lawyers, Sharon Sir, who's with Withers in Hong Kong. And Sharon and I were speaking to this group of families, and I said, divorce is the biggest destroyer of wealth in the world. And Sharon jumped up and said, Philip is lying. He's not telling the truth. Divorce is not the biggest destroyer of wealth in the world. Divorce is the biggest creator of wealth in the world. Of course, Sharon very often is acting for the person who is detaching the money from the person from whom the divorce is taking place. So lots and lots of issues about divorce, but one thing that I want to talk about for a moment in relation to communication within families is the importance of discussing divorce with the younger generation in the context of prenuptial agreements and the importance of having clarity in financial arrangements in marriages. The importance of discussing this before your son or daughter comes home holding hands with the love of their life. Your daughter comes home, Mom, Dad, here's the guy who I love and I want to marry. I want to introduce you to him. You then say to your daughter, excuse me, can you come to the kitchen for a moment? We want to have a chat with you. And then you talk about prenups. Your daughter then relates the discussion about prenups to what you think about the person that they brought home. What I believe is critical is to have these kind of discussions well before your kids come home with the love of their life, and make sure that they understand the importance of discussions about prenups, about money in relationships. Luca, any thoughts about that?
I think you're absolutely right. And my parents did not tell me about prenuptial and postnuptial agreements until I found out for myself in law school. But this is actually a very important area, because before I actually learned about it in school, it wasn't something me and generally my generation really understood. The fact is, you can sign a contract before marriage, and I'll help divide up how your wealth is going to, what will happen to the wealth if you got divorced. Postnuptial agreements are an agreement you sign after marriage that do the same thing. Neither one is fully binding. That's another thing to understand, is even if you're aware of the concept, you might not understand the intricacies of it. A young relationship can sign a prenuptial agreement that's very detailed. They get married, and the judge might still throw it out completely. It is not 100% binding. What's important is that you mitigate your risks. You can sign a prenuptial agreement, a postnuptial agreement. And it's also important to understand there's many things around that's not even necessarily marriage that can entail rights. Cohabitation rights is another thing I didn't learn until I went to law school. But in many countries, such as in England and in Scandinavia, simply living with someone for a set amount of time will be enough for there to be rights on your wealth should that relationship end. And having an understanding of all of this and having it out in the open and discussing it within a family just helps. It helps everyone just plan and be aware of how their wealth can be affected by all these different issues.
And because paranoia runs in families, that's why Luca is all by himself in lockdown in London and doesn't have some pretty young thing next to it.
So Philip, we have a question either Luca or yourself can ask. I mean, they're asking, how do you overcome the awkwardness to have the daughter or son-in-law to sign, and who is the one having the conversation? I assume Luca would be having the conversation. I mean, just maybe help a little bit on making it a little more tactical, what you just shared.
Sure. At least from my perspective, I think a way that could be similar to what my dad said. It would be great if you could have this conversation before your son and daughter actually brings their spouse to be. If you have a conversation with your kids, even when they're, early teens or something like that, just so they're aware what prenuptial agreements are, what postnuptial agreements are, and have it instilled in them that you can sign these contracts irrespective of who your spouse is. You can love them, you can not love them. These agreements might still be in place regardless. And you can even write them in a way that isn't unfair or isn't, you can have them customized any way you want. You can have a structure where the wealth you go into the relationship with is your own, but any income you earn while you're together, that is then split in terms of divorce. You can really make these as detailed or as unique as you want.
So Philip, I see a lot in Europe where the older generation makes it very clear is that whoever is coming into the family, if they refuse to sign the prenup, they skip a generation. Are you seeing more and more of that or less of that?
There, particularly when you're dealing with a significant family business or other arrangement, absolutely there are people who do that. But what's very important here, Faisal, and for everyone, is to also, again, it's communication within the family, and it's not just about prenups, and it's not just about protecting the assets, but isn't it right that before people get married, there should be an open conversation about finances? Isn't it healthy for a new marriage that there is a conversation about, okay, how are we as a couple going to deal with the financial arrangements between us? That should be a very early conversation. I have met people who have said to me a few days before their wedding, they've taken me aside and they've said, Philip, I'm not sure if the woman or the guy I'm about to marry is marrying me for my money. You know, I'm dealing with a lot of families who are very, very wealthy. It's too late, 2-3 days before the wedding, to be talking about these kind of things. So I'm such a great believer that it's important to have this discussion early. Now, you asked as well the question of, you know, who should have the conversation with the other spouse. Well, you know, the most appropriate is, you know, the person in the younger generation who's entering into the relationship. And if it's something that has been well communicated to the younger generation, exactly as Luca has said, you know, in terms of the logic and the need to talk about finances generally, I think it can be a very gentle conversation. But in some families, yes, as an advisor, I'm sometimes asked to have this conversation, and it has to be done in a very sensitive and appropriate way early enough. Families also need to understand, and they sometimes don't, that trusts do not necessarily protect against claims from in a divorce situation. Courts more and more look through trusts when it comes to a divorce. And as a result, what's very important to also understand is if your kid is getting distributions from a trust that has a lot in it, that whole trust may be exposed in a divorce claim. If you have more than one trust and your kids get distributions from a little trust, while the family business and other things are kept in a separate structure, which could also be a trust that is not making distributions to the kids, that bigger trust will not be exposed in the same way to a marital claim. So there's a lot that needs to be thought about and considered, and divorce can be highly destructive of family businesses and of family wealth. And it is one of the many important topics that really needs to be discussed with the younger generation at an early stage.
Philip,
But there are lots of needs. Here's another list of more needs within families. And as I mentioned, you know, just about, you know, identifying the assets, knowing where the assets are, business succession, all of these things require discussions within families.
Also, just to add on to this, I think especially in terms of prenuptial agreements and postnuptial agreements, there's maybe a preconceived notion that this is going to be a difficult conversation. It's not going to be something your kids want to hear about, or something they're going to argue against you with. It doesn't have to be like that. The concept of things like these agreements can be brought to the family at a really young age, and it can be made into a discussion. Not that this is the prenuptial agreement you must sign, but it can be a discussion of how would you and us like to structure this within our family. And in that sense, you're not pitting two sides against each other at all. You're making it into quite a collaborative process.
And you can see from Luca's comments, you know, it can sometimes be useful to involve in this process someone like Luca. In other words, not having, you know, the advisor in their 60s who's having a chat with a 23-year-old, but to have, you know, someone like Luca who's 26 have that conversation, who's able to bring their own perspective into it. And there are lots of options, you know, for that kind of an approach. So how you address these issues is important, but critical is when you address them. Don't wait until the last minute. This should be part of the conversation within families at very, very early stages. Let me say a few words about changing demographics. You know, again, I'll tell a little bit of a Luca story. He came home from school once when he was, I think, I forget how old, maybe 10, 11, 12. And he said, Dad, I said to him, as always, you know, what did you learn in school today? And Dad, you're asking us the same question again. And Luca said, well, today we learned about demographics. And I was very impressed that he had this big word that he was using, demographics. And I said, okay, you know, what did you learn? You know, what did they talk about demographics? And he said, well, you know, Dad, in Japan, there are too many old people. And there's not a, you know, there aren't enough young people who are going to be able to pay all the pensions of the old people. He said, Dad, why do they keep people alive after age 70? You know, why don't we just, you know, kill people when they reach 70? That's when I knew I couldn't trust my kids to look after us in our old age. And I needed a trust to take care of me in the future. But more seriously about changing demographics, the reality is we're now in a world where people are living till 95, 100, 110. This changes dramatically how families need to deal with succession. For example, if somebody, you know, some of you who are in Asia, you may be familiar with Run Run Shaw, who passed away, I think, at 103. There was a photograph in the South China Morning Post of his sons at Run Run Shaw's funeral, his sons in their 80s, not spring chickens. Should people be waiting until their 80s to inherit from their parents? Or in a world of changing demographics, should the older generation be thinking of passing wealth on to the younger generation at some earlier stage? Also, the reality is, while we're all living longer, we also have the issue of dementia. You know, it's not just Alzheimer's, but all kinds of forms of dementia, loss of memory and other things. This becomes a great danger to family wealth as well. All of these issues about aging populations need to be part of conversations within families at the right time about, you know, what's going to happen as people get older, how are assets going to be dealt with, how are all these things going to be part of the plan within the family. I'll ask a very polite question. Is your family nuts? In fact, I know the answer. Your family is nuts. And if anyone on this conference call says, no, our family is not nuts, our family is perfectly normal, you're the most nuts of all. The reality is wealth makes people crazy. And part of family discussions and conversations should be trying to diffuse all of this. And maybe, Luca, I'll ask you the question, is your family nuts?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit. We have really not much time. I'll just spend one more minute, you know, talking about a couple of things. There are lots of tools in wealth planning, trusts, foundations, insurance products, many tools. We're not going to go through these. The most important thing for all families, and it's got to be part of the conversation, is really understanding your own structures. Don't let your advisors kidnap the planning process. And you can look at these slides a little bit later on. And one of the things that I say is, don't trust anyone. And what needs to be also understood is, for a lot of advisors, no client is better than a dead client. A dead client doesn't complain about fees. A dead client doesn't fire you. Hopefully a dead client doesn't call you in the middle of the night. You know, the reality is, when you have a structure and you have advisors that have roles within that structure, they can go to town in terms of what it is that they're doing if there are no checks and balances to keep an eye on what those advisors are doing. And what's really critical is, as we have said, age-appropriate communication, family retreats, family agreements or constitutions to deal with how families are going to relate to each other. And the development of family members is very important. In other words, giving the younger generation an opportunity to really learn about all of the kind of things that we're talking about today. And I really am a believer that the older generation has a responsibility. They have a responsibility to leave a clean slate for the younger generation as much as possible, not to pass their problems and confusion on to that younger generation. And if any of you are interested, I wrote a book about this topic and many of these other topics that we've touched about, which is called The Destructive Power of Family Wealth. In fact, the publisher argued with me about the title. My original title was going to be Wealth Destroys Families. And the publisher said, you know, that's too negative. And we eventually compromised on this destructive power of family wealth. But what I'll do is maybe pass it over to Faisal to let us know if there are additional questions and to give us a couple of comments about what we've discussed so far before we move on to some other things that Faisal will want to share with us.
Sure. So we've got somebody asking about, just to share more about living wills, if you can share a little bit more about living wills. And then after that, to look at, I mean, you say not to openly trust advisors. So what would you recommend in terms of selecting an advisor who can help the family and minimize the damage?
Okay, so let me say a word about living wills, and then I'll say a word about advisors, and I'm going to ask Luca to comment on the advisor point that I'm going to make. First of all, on living wills, absolutely. You know, what's critical is to consider what do you need to put in place to make sure that your thoughts about care, for example, are put in place. In other words, you know, one of the conversations I often have with my wife is, you know, don't bloody pull the plug. In my case, you know, I don't want to be, you know, the plug to be pulled. You know, every time, you know, I fall asleep, she wants to pull the plug. So you've got to make it very, very clear that, you know, what it is you actually intend and what you want to have happen. And your living will is part of that. Also linked to the living will is also the question of who should take care of your financial affairs if you become disabled. You know, I touched on, you know, it's mostly men rather than women, you know, these 70, 60, you know, men of my age, a little bit later, who, you know, meet these pretty young things who are in their 20s and they think that they're in love, and the 20-year-old is after love, not money. You know, the reality is if you marry somebody and you then become disabled, likely your spouse is going to be the one who is going to be given by the court the ability to make financial decisions when you're not able to make those decisions. You better be sure that's what you want. And you don't want your kids, for example, maybe they're better placed to be making those financial decisions. So living will is part of it. And part of it is also other arrangements regarding who should take care of things if you're not able. Now on advisors, we need advisors. We need advisors. It's a very complicated world. No one has all the answers. We need advisors. But the most important thing is to understand every single person in this world has conflicts of interest. Any advisor who tells you they don't have a conflict of interest is not telling you the truth. They are always having some interest of their own in the picture. And the key is you need to understand and manage those conflicts of interest. And you need your kids to understand the questions that they need to ask. And one of the things we've tried to do is to begin to get our kids to understand how do advisors charge, what you should be looking at. And something that I'm going to ask Luca to react to, you know, we have ourselves, one of the private banks that we work with, you know, we agreed what fees they're supposed to be charging us. We also have another person who has the job of getting all the information from different asset managers and checking not only performance, but checking what are the fees that are being charged. And a few years ago, we were overcharged by 75,000 Swiss francs, and the bank, you know, refunded the 75 and said, oh, we're really sorry. You know, we had changed our accounting system. We're really sorry that this happened. They sent us a very nice bottle of wine and apologies and all that. Just a couple of weeks ago, we again had, you know, fees checked because we do it every year. And now they made a mistake of around 25,000. It's always in their favor for some reason, these mistakes. And now they've refunded us the 25,000 or 30,000 into the picture. So Luca, you know, how do you feel about this thing about advisors and keeping an eye on advisors? And do you feel you're starting to get the sense that you need to keep an eye on them? You need to unmute.
Just a quick comment about living wills as well. Similar to what my dad mentioned earlier, no plan is a plan. If you don't have something in place with your will and so on, and something were to happen, there are automatic functions that would happen in that case. So not having a plan doesn't mean there isn't a plan that would happen. That might not be to your preference. And also in terms of marrying people, or like someone older, say marrying someone younger and they think it's for love or money, it can be both, just to bring more awareness to that as well. In terms of advisors, I think the important thing here is to really understand yourself, what the advisor is doing, what you want them to do, so that while they're doing it, you can also act for yourself as the check and balances. At least in my own case, my parents have set up all these structures with different advisors. What's important here is that me and my brother understand who the advisors are, what they're supposed to be doing. So in the event that my parents do pass or something along those lines, we understand what these advisors are supposed to do and therefore keep them in check and balances. So when you're going out to find an advisor, it's important for you yourself to really understand what is it you want them to do for you so that you can really make sure that they're doing it right. That's the important thing.
So Philip, just on terms of structures and trusts, is there something that you feel more confident on in these days? I mean, I know nothing is bulletproof, but what do you feel is something that is more sustainable?
What I feel is very important, trusts are a very important tool. So trusts come into it for many, many families. But what I'm a great believer in, Faisal, is diversification of ownership structures. Again, as I said earlier, if I go to an investment advisor and I say, how should I invest my money? All investment advisors, or most of them, are going to say, well, the safest thing is make sure you're diversified in your investments. Make sure you're diversified in your currencies. Make sure you're diversified in the geographies in which you're investing. What people don't pay attention to is the need to diversify the ownership structures of their assets. Very often families will have everything in one holding company, in one trust that is holding things for their family. And that creates risk from a number of fronts on many, many different perspectives. So what I'm a believer in is actually having different structures, including family limited partnerships, including having a trust, including other vehicles that may be interesting, including insurance structures in some cases, that may be interesting for the family. We are in an increasingly dangerous world of political risk, of tax risk, of information flows, all of these things. And, you know, this is a very interesting area, a very challenging area, but it's this diversification of ownership that I'd really be advocating.
All right, Philip, one last question before we wrap up. I was going to ask part of it, but this is a little even deeper. It says, in case of a completely dependent family member with special needs, what is the approach that you recommend to protect their wealth as they grow up and as their parents pass away? Because this is somebody who obviously will not be able to make the decisions on their own. What have you had experience with this, and what would you recommend? And on a lighter note, even people marrying in with, you know, bloodline only in terms of shareholdings, I receive many calls asking, how do we protect our spouses? Because most of the assets are bloodline only, and how do we have that conversation? And what do we do? What do you recommend? So these are some of the things that are coming up, and obviously this is a particular case with the special needs. Can you touch on both of those before we wrap things up?
When we talk about special needs, yes, I've run across this many, many times. And special needs are different, you know, different kinds of special needs, and there's no real one answer. A trust clearly can be very useful, where you have a trust and there's a trustee who, you know, is taking care of the assets for that family member, and you know, you're monitoring how much money that they're getting. I'm a great believer, if it's appropriate within the family, to have family involvement in that. So, you know, one of the families I work with, they have this kind of situation. We have the brothers who have to give input to the trustees regarding how much, you know, the daughter who needs this kind of protection should be getting. But I do want to take the opportunity, Faisal, to maybe just mention that sometimes people view there to be disabilities that are actually, that need to be challenged. I had a client a number of years ago who said to me, Philip, I want my assets to be divided in my trust in the following way. I want my daughter, who's 15 years old, to get $200,000 US a year for the rest of her life, inflation adjusted. and all the rest of my money, and it was someone with around 100 million or 150 million dollars, all the rest of my money goes to my other two kids 50-50, one of whom is now 9 years old and the other one is 11. And I said, can I understand why you're doing this? And he said, well, my daughter has anorexia. She's anorexic. She's driving me crazy. She's not eating, and she can't be trusted with money. And, you know, what I said to him is, look, you know, anorexia is a disease. You know, this is not, you know, this is something, you know, I know it's very difficult for you, but do you really want to send a message with your wealth? You remember I said, you know, don't communicate in families with your money. You know, if you want to communicate, talk to your kids. Don't communicate, you know, with your money. Do you really want to leave, you know, your daughter years later? Everything is, you know, she's managing her eating disorder. She's managing all of that. But meanwhile, she's been punished by her father and the other two kids. Who knows how those other two kids are going to turn out? They're 8 years old and 11 years old. They're getting all the assets. You know, creating unfairness within a family creates lasting damage. It really requires a lot of thinking in this area. And then your question about the spouse is very, very important because, you know, a lot of the comments that I've been making, you know, in this session are about, you know, how do you keep the wealth away from the nasty, from the gold diggers? How do you, you know, do all this kind of stuff? And the reality is, come on, you know, spouses, you know, are deserving of assets, and you need to be thoughtful about how that is really going to work. And again, it comes back to a little bit the discussion Luca and I had about prenups and about conversations about wealth within families and being very open. And there are lots of ways, you know, to deal with the assets. In my own case, in my own marriage, my wife's philosophy is what's mine is mine, she says, and what's yours is mine. And that's basically how we operate. So everything is hers. I have nothing. You've got to unmute, Faisal.
On that note, thank you very much, Philip, Luca. An absolute pleasure and treat to have you, to be able to see perspective from the reality check on what Philip shares. And obviously he's advising many of the people watching as well as many others. So it's always good to see that he's walking the talk. Thank you, Philip, again, for the time, the generosity, the sharing. And for everyone, we will be sending the recordings over. You'll get a copy of the slides. And if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out, and we'll be more than happy to do that. We have many more webinars coming up next week, change in gear, some talking about human capacity in terms of, you know, the fact that we're all living longer. So how do we create that limitlessness? Then also looking at, you know, how to strengthen bonds and relationships, something Philip talked about in terms of communication and relationship. Luca talked about going on that retreat. And then again, dealing with the uncertainty, which we are definitely living in unprecedented times. So once again, thank you very much, Philip. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, everyone, for the generosity of your time. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.